Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of lots of stuff, but today I'm going to be focusing on the first of those, novelist, and this is part of my series of sort of Ask Me Anything writing questions where I respond to things that people have sent me. And I had a number of questions that were sort of backed up from late last year, and I was going to try to sort of squeeze a bunch of them into a single video, but a couple of these questions are really, quite large in their implications, and so I kind of wanted to deal with them, if not separately, then in very, very small groups. So we'll see how long this goes today, but I'm going to start by answering just one question, and maybe if there's time I'll get to a second, but for now I'm going to focus on one. The question comes from Surface of the Moon, one of my patrons, incidentally, and you should check out my patron page. It says, "Hey AJ, question for future consideration. I know everyone starts their writing differently. I'm quite curious, what do you find is the usual genesis of a writing project for you? Do you find yourself crafting a fully formed idea before you start putting words down? Do you find yourself thinking of interesting prompts that you then begin writing your answer to? Or is there some other way, if in fact there is any consistent way at all for your projects to begin?" This is a really good question. It's the kind of thing that I have been sort of tossed at conventions and things a number of times, and usually have a fairly quick, reasonably pat answer. And I'll start there, but then I want to complicate it a little bit. So the first answer, of course, is that a story can begin anywhere. And for me, looking back over my career, books have originated in a number of different places. I don't want to use this to pitch my own stuff, but for instance, something like Steeplejack grew out of an idea about the world of the story. What if I have a murder mystery of sorts that takes place in a world that looks like Victorian South Africa, that has a huge sort of London-like metropolitan city in the middle of a distinctly African kind of environment, which is defined by racial conflict, but also surrounded by the animals of the African savannah. That's a world that I had not seen before. And I thought, if I can write characters that are grounded in that kind of story, then there's something interesting that will come from that. Something like Cold Bath Street, that story was set in my hometown, but the core premise was, what happens if my main character is killed? It's a ghost story, but what if my main character is killed right at the beginning? So it's a ghost story written from the perspective of the ghost. And the question then becomes, if you're already dead, how much worse can it get? And then there are questions that originate in a more simple realist situation. What if you hire a live-in nanny who is not who she claims to be? Where does the story go from there? So I think part of what I'm saying here is that, sometimes the idea is about a place. Sometimes, or it's inspired by a place, sometimes it's inspired by an imaginary place or by particular notions of character. But more than anything else, it's driven by a core premise. And this is what I really want to talk about, because I think that this is becoming more and more important. When you talk about writing, the first thing everybody should say is that you write the story that you want to write, right? You don't write by chasing after a market. You don't chase what you think other people want to read. You write the book that you want to read. You write the book that you're going to be excited to spend time in. But increasingly, I think, you have to think to a certain extent about, to use a corporate speech, end user. Novels are not journals. They're not diary entries. They imagine an audience. And I think you kind of have to think about that very early on in the process, if only so that your parameters for success become clearer in your own head. I want to write a story, and I'm writing it kind of for myself, of course, but I want it to have a readership. I want to connect with people. I want to share my story. I want other people to be excited or entertained or whatever by what it is that I'm writing. I want to participate in their internal life. Yeah, that's kind of what writers do, right? They want to be part of a conversation in your head. So imagining audience is kind of an essential thing. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can do this. One way is that early in this writing process, before you have really written anything down, you start to say, what kind of a story am I telling, right? That's sort of crucial. You might have some plot ideas, you might have, as I say, a character note or a place or whatever. But along with those things, you're going to have some kind of impression of the story's genre or its feel, its tonality. Is this a murder mystery, say? And if it is a murder mystery, what kind of a murder mystery is it? Is it very cozy, quiet, not too threatening, fairly light, not too heavy on big ideas or emotions, but entertaining and playful? Or is it darker, more serious? Is it more like a police procedural where you're going to do a lot of research in exactly how forensics work and how local judicial administrations work, whatever, right? Where it's going to be very dependent on getting things as close to right, accurate, and gritty realist as you can? Or is it going to be more a puzzle? I'm in a nice Irish village and somebody's been murdered and I'm going to figure it out by talking to all the locals who are interesting little characters who run shops and things. And that tends to be a much lighter kind of story, and it feels very different. So identifying the premise of your story by genre, I think, is really important. But there's an important proviso. You know, I do a lot of conventions. I have a lot of friends who are fantasy and sci-fi writers. And sometimes when you talk to them about what they're working on, the genre is kind of taken for granted. They say, oh, you know, yeah, I'm working on this fantasy story and it's got this really interesting magic system, or it's got this really complex world building. And that's fine, but you're immediately losing most of the readers in the world. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are pros and cons to working strictly within genre. One of the pros is that as soon as you identify the genre that you're working in, a lot of the building blocks and premises of the form immediately kick in. If I say I'm writing a murder mystery, then immediately we know somebody's going to die early in the book. I'm going to then go, my detective character, whoever that is then going to go through a process of investigation. Clues are going to appear. Those are going to be analyzed and put together. Maybe somebody else will die along the way. Maybe there'll be an element of danger, depending, again, on the tonality of the story. But at the end, the original crime and maybe any subsequent crimes are going to get solved, and there's going to be a reveal. This is a whodunit, right? The key question of the story is who. If I write something that has more of a thriller component, the key questions are going to be how and what, right? How am I going to get through this? How am I going to survive? Because there are elements of danger or things. But my point is that the moment you identify the genre, especially a tight genre like mystery or high fantasy, then there are a whole bunch of things that the readership simply takes for granted right from the start. And that is a good thing for readers who are into that particular thing. It's a bad thing for readers who are not into that particular genre, which is why I say you immediately lose a whole chunk of the reading public the moment you say it's a mystery or it's a fantasy novel or it's military sci-fi. A whole bunch of people are not interested in military sci-fi. A much smaller number are immediately interested when you tell them it's military sci-fi. Oh, I like military sci-fi. But I think, you know, these things can be good, they can be crutches, and I'm operating on the assumption here that whether you're writing a genre book or not a genre book is not of itself a good or a bad thing. This is not a value judgment. I'm merely thinking in terms of how you position your stories. In the old days, let's say 50 years ago, if you said it's a fantasy novel, then we know what shelf it's going to go on. We know what the cover art is going to kind of look like, right? These things are going to say genre. They're going to announce the genre, and it's going to be in the bookstores. And people who read that kind of stuff will gravitate to it, and they'll pick it up and say, "I'm going to try that." And the fact that it's in that section might be all they need. And to a certain extent, this is still true. But the market has changed. There's simply so much more of every kind of book imaginable out there, and therefore so much more competition, so much harder to stand out. So the vast majority of people who write mysteries or fantasy novels will not be in the bookstore. The vast majority of those books will never be carried in Barnes & Noble or Waterstones or whatever. They just won't. There are too many of them. The big ones get picked up by those booksellers. The small press ones, the independently published, self-published books don't. Unless something special happens, you know? So with the pros and cons that come with genre, right, you have, to a certain extent, certain structures, as I've suggested, about how the story is going to unfold. And the extent to which your story is doing something radically different maybe doesn't matter quite as much. If you're going to tell a competent detective story, for example, and you're going to check the boxes of the genre as you go, so long as people find the ending satisfying, it'd probably be okay. Because people who read mystery stories want a satisfying mystery. The problem, of course, is that most readers don't simply want to read a mystery where the ending is the only thing that matters. They want something that is engaging and interesting from the first page all the way through to the end. And that's much harder to do. It's not an accident that movie producers used to be super suspicious about the idea of crime stories being made into movies, because, as they said, you know, why would we invest a fortune in a story that hinges on the moment when the audience is reaching for their hat and ready to leave the theater? In other words, that final whodunit reveal at the end. Which is a roundabout way of saying that the books that do best, it seems to me, with a small exception of the few absolute classic genre books that are allowed to flourish and become huge successes because they're written by big names or whatever, right? Most of the books that are doing well at the moment are not exactly genre books. They're books that are driven by premise, where there's something that you can put on the back of the book in the first few sentences that will immediately say to an audience member or a reader in a bookstore or wherever, this sounds interesting. And the problem with writing a conventional murder mystery where it hinges on the reveal at the end is that that's not going to go on the back of the book. The problem with writing a fantasy novel which hinges on the kind of magic system that you use or the world building or whatever is that, again, that's not going to go on the back of the book. Those things are taken for granted. The moment you say it's a fantasy novel, we assume those kind of things. The moment you say it's a murder mystery, we assume those kind of things. So then people say, oh, well, you know, my murder mystery is really interesting because the detective has this particular issue or background. So it's like, okay, fine, yeah, maybe. Or the ending is really unexpected. Like, okay, but readers today are not going to give you 250 pages before the book gets interesting. This is what I mean. When you look at the back of a book, the first couple of sentences describing the book are what will sell it to most readers. Now, if you're like me, you will also look inside the book and you'll read some of the actual sentences and see whether the writing is something that appeals to you. But a lot of what is going to drive it is that premise. And in this sense, this is another area where books have become a lot more like movies. And that old adage that I think it was Steven Spielberg said, you know, if you can't sell a movie idea in 26 words or less, it shouldn't be made. You want a premise that's so strong that people immediately sit up and think, oh, that sounds interesting. You know, giant shark terrorizes New England town. I mean, I use this example all the time because it's one of those high concept premises that immediately suggests what the story is going to be. And then we can start refining it and say, oh, and the mayor wants to keep the beaches open because it's crucial to the revenue of the environment. But the chief of police is suspicious, but the chief of police is afraid of water. So that's going to be a problem for him. And they have to bring in experts. And one of them is a academic marine biologist, and another is a sort of grizzled shark hunting fisherman, and they're going to butt heads. So that all the sort of personal stuff then starts to flesh out the premise, and you can see where this is going to be all, generative of interesting stuff. But the core idea is still giant shark terrorizes New England town. And what makes the movie Jaws work is because it takes all those elements really seriously. And it takes the characters really seriously. And at no point does it say, this is just a schlock monster movie, But that premise is still driving everything. And it says, what if we take that idea really seriously and explore the lives of these people and the consciousnesses of the characters? That's our movie. But it's still really, really short and simple. That is not something that you can do for most genre fiction. Other than say, it's a detective story. And then here are the things. And the body's found in a church or at Stonehenge or on the moon. I mean, it barely matters. So to come back to the question, what I find myself wrestling with more than anything else is how to generate that premise, that statement that can go in the first couple of sentences on the back of the book that will immediately sell the story, right? At least potentially, right? And when I was talking about before, it's a ghost story, but the ghost is the main character. The protagonist is killed in the first chapter. That's the kind of thing, not everybody's going to read it, but some are going to go, ooh, that sounds interesting. I have not read this before. And the key is that those things have to happen fast. They can't be things that you sit on. If it's going to be on the back jacket of the book, then you want that stuff to be established within the first couple of chapters, 50 pages tops. That stuff needs to be upfront and early, and then the story can take off. But what's going to hook that reader has to happen quick. And that's what you want. I've done this enough. I've written, I've published 27 novels. And I am realistic about what I know I can do and what I find hard. And some of the stuff that I know I can always get better, but I can put sentences together. And I can get into the heads of characters, and I can build the detailed stuff that expands the story. What I can't do is fix a premise midway through a writing project if I realize that it's not interesting enough to make this book stand out. If I can't turn to my agent and say, I'm writing this book and I give you a paragraph, and immediately she says, I want to read that. I want to read that book. And I think other people will want to read that book. And that is all about coming up with the right idea, coming up with the big idea that stands out. And this, is a sort of proviso on conversations I've had before about writer's block, where I say, in some ways I don't have time for writer's block. There are always ways to figure out ways to extract yourself out of difficult situations or situations in a story where you're stuck and you don't know what has to happen. I stand by all those things. What you can't do, however, is fix a story where the premise is bad or dull. Dull is worse than bad. So what I spend a lot of time thinking about before I start a project is how can I come up with the elevator pitch, the 30-second summary that doesn't tell the story and doesn't tell you how great my writing is or my characterization or anything, but something in the premise that says, this is something you haven't seen before, something that immediately makes this story more interesting than the one sitting next to it on the shelf or the one next to it on the Amazon tab or whatever. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm wrestling with a couple of ideas because I feel like I can invest myself in both, and I'm excited about both, but they're very different stories, and I need help figuring out which is the one to commit to, or at least to commit to first. So what I do is I'll build those core premises and then start to ask the questions of myself that will expand this. Here's my core story idea. Who are my characters? What's my location? how do I ratchet up the tension at certain points within the story? It might not be, I say tension because it might have that sort of thriller component, but it doesn't have to be tension in that sense. Maybe if you're writing a romantic comedy, there's still ways to ratchet up the intensity of the story as you go through so that it doesn't feel like it's a lull. But, you know, romantic comedies are hard to get the strong premise, right? It's like, oh, well, it's a guy and he meets this girl and he falls in love with her and she's not really interested in him, but at the end they get together. Okay. That sounds like a million other books. What is it that I can put on there that will immediately say, oh, wow, yeah, that's different? So I'm answering the question by not answering it. I'm answering the question by saying this is what I strive for. This is what I try to find. But I don't think there's a magic solution. I think there are ways to test it when you have the beginnings of this premise. I think you can ask other people. You share it if you have a writing group or if you have other friends, and just say, "What do you think of this idea?" And then ignore what they actually say. Right? What you're watching is for their excitement or their interest. What you want is a premise that makes people go, "Huh, that's all." That's all. That's the full extent. The rest is about sentences, right? Where you're building characters and you're building action sequences or whatever it is. You can do that if you're a practiced writer. You can do that. You trust. That's about your toolbox, about dipping into the various sort of arsenal of skills that you're building or have built. The thing you can't fix is the premise. So that's where we want to start. We want to start with an idea that is so strong that the story practically writes itself, especially if you then add the appropriate wrinkles and complications and tweaks and twists and all the rest of it that suit the kind of story that you're trying to tell. But you know, I was reading a book recently called Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. And it's a story about a woman, an older woman, and there's a sort of a mystery and a sort of a romance, but she's working in a kind of, is it an aquarium or a kind of nature museum on the coast somewhere in the Northeast? And part of the story is told from the perspective of an octopus in a tank. And immediately, right, so there's a human narrative going on, but at the same time, there's this commentary from the octopus, who is completely sentient and knows what's going on and is passing comment based on his unique experience as an octopus in a tank on what he's seeing happen around him amongst the humans and in his own sort of desire to escape back into the ocean, That's a story I hadn't read before. And it's immediately compelling. It's like, and again, that's something that you can put in the first sentence of the book jacket. You don't have to make people wait for the thing that makes the story interesting. It's right there up front. Then you get to build the story. And then you're going to find other ways to sort of keep that interest going. But what you want more than anything else, I think, is something where the premise is so strong right from the beginning that immediately that hooks the reader's attention. And I think that one of the dangers of being a genre writer is that writers get stuck in their own kind of story and they think that a competently executed version of a murder mystery or a fantasy novel or whatever is enough. And the truth is, it's not anymore. It has to stand out. It has to have something that immediately grabs the reader. So that's what I would say. And I realize that that's not an answer exactly, because I don't think there's an easy formula for that. But I think you can keep asking yourself, what would make this more compelling? What would make this something I've never read before? And then it's about the execution. But I hate to say this because I'm all about execution. I'm all about the sentence level stuff. But I don't think execution gets the book sold. I think premise gets the book sold. So to quickly answer the specifics of the question also, in terms of prompts, I don't tend to. I know that this is something that creative writing instructors often use. I've used them in classes when you're trying to jumpstart an idea, particularly ideas for a number of people at the same time. But it's not something that I do by myself. So for me, I'll start a project by scribbling down on typing up any ideas that I have that I think might be interesting and sort of talking my way through it. So if you look at any of my introductory note documents, there'll be a number of different versions of the same story that sort of evolves as it goes. And I'll come back over it and I'll read what I've written before, and then I'll say, no, I need to go in a different direction. But I do come up with some kind of outline or synopsis once I have established the kind of premise and the sort of story that I'm trying to tell. And I'll work on those before I ever start writing. I'm not the kind of person who's just going to dive in and start writing, because if I do that, I get caught up in things that I'm interested in about this character or something, but I'm not thinking macro enough. I need to think macro because I think readers think macro. I think people who buy books want to know the larger thing about a story that is going to make it compelling before they invest in the small stuff. So that's what I do. All right, so I've been going on far too long, but I'll leave it at that, and I will address the other questions as individual questions. So this is something that you can respond to, share what you think in the comments. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe. Yeah, this is supposed to be a conversation, so feel free to respond, share examples of books that you found particularly exciting or compelling, and let's talk about what makes them so that people who are writing can look at that and say, okay, that's what I need to shoot for. Because that's the thing, isn't it? I find whenever I'm reading something that I'm finding really exciting or great, or the opposite, if I'm finding it terrible, I have to stop myself and say, what is or is not working about this that I can incorporate into my own arsenal, that I can learn from, So yeah, that. Check out my books, of course. Check out my Patreon page. My patrons make this channel, which is not monetized, possible, so that I can keep making these little videos. And check out my little merchandise page. Thanks for sending the questions in. Feel free to keep those coming. Cheers. Talk to you soon. Bye.